following the very interesting previous discussion panel, now we have a very interesting presentation from a distinguished scientific doctor, and Dr. Joe Kosterich. He's coming from Australia, from far away from here. He's a medical doctor, speaker, author, and covers media and often give opinions in medical legal as a medical legal expert. But the most important is that he's a very good doctor and a professor to the medical schools. His interest to e-cigarettes has come from listening to experience of her patients. So we have a presentation now from a distinguished doctor that he tried to analyze us a dilemma about New Zealand and Australia, the different approach toward THR of contracting the cases of New Zealand and Australia. So Joe, we following to your speech now.
Look, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and look, thank you for the organisers for inviting me to give the talk this afternoon. I'm just going to share the screen and put on the slideshow, which hopefully everybody can now see. Look, it's quite, I suppose, auspicious that I'm talking today, and interestingly, I'm on the west coast of Australia. It's about 20 to 11 at night. On the east coast of Australia, it's already Friday morning. And October 1 is the day when new regulations come into effect in Australia, where vaping is effectively banned unless people have a prescription from a doctor. And I've been doing some media today. I've been on radio, I've spoken to some newspapers and TV. And one of the main things that I've done really is contrast the position in Australia versus New Zealand. And look, we are neighbouring countries, we're similar countries, both originally settled by the British. I think in terms of economic, we are the two closest countries in the world. But on this, and look, on some other things, and obviously we play each other at rugby and cricket, but on this, it's extraordinary, the different tack that's been taken by the two countries. And it was interesting just listening to the previous discussion about salt, and I could go on about saturated fats as well. And I think the biggest issue in public health is that generally these people do not deal with the public. I spend 2 days a week in a general practice. In America, you'd call it the family physician. And I actually deal with members of the public, some of whom smoke, some of whom have given up smoking through vaping, which is, as was said, was my initial entrance into this space. If I sat in some ivory tower, I could talk about populations all day long. I never actually have to see the people on the receiving end of my policies. So look, just a couple of disclaimers first up. I'm a consultant to Little Green Farm, which is a medicinal cannabis company. I'll leave them up there for a moment. I won't read them all out. Look, in this instance, I suppose really I'm the chairman of Australian Tobacco Harm Reduction Association, which is founded a couple of years ago by Colin Mendelsohn. I'm sure you're all familiar with Colin. So ultimately, who is this about? I don't smoke. I never have smoked. My late grandmother on my late father's side, I remember as a kid, I think smoked occasionally. That was about it. My parents never smoked. I'm happy to say my children don't smoke, neither does my partner. My father-in-law is in his high 80s. He was a smoker, not anymore. So I arguably don't have any particular personal axe to grind in all of this. So this is a shot of Bondi Beach, obviously before lockdowns in Australia. And this is all about people. This is all about the public. And it's often about people who, as I say, the public health ideologues don't deal with in their ivory towers. And they just don't deal with the public in the outer suburbs of Australia. And these are the people who in Australia, 80% of people with mental health problems are thought to smoke. 40%, 40, of the Indigenous population smokes. That is 3 times the national average. And yet the quit program congratulates itself on what a great job it's doing. It's doing an appalling job. So it's about the people who smoke and are trying to stop smoking and who have tried all the methods that the experts talk about and are still smoking. Look, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Michael Russell, a man ahead of his time. He did a thesis in the late 60s and early 70s and concluded that nicotine was the motivator of smoking. And he understood the difference between nicotine and cigarettes. And his essential view was that, and a lot of you obviously be familiar with the GFN, the Global Forum on Nicotine. I was very honoured in 2018 to be able to deliver the Michael Russell oration. That smokers come for the nicotine, but get killed by the delivery system. That's not exactly word for word. And 50 years later, we haven't still grasped that concept that Michael Russell understood in the late 1960s. And he really did get the concept of harm reduction, a man well ahead of his time. Now, this slide is interesting. I put it up to talk about what's called the horse manure crisis of the late 1890s. And there was a three-day conference held in New York to discuss the problems of horse manure in the streets of major cities in the world, including New York, London, Chicago, I suspect Paris and other cities as well. And after 3 days, the conference broke up and they did not have a solution to the horse manure crisis. Nobody had a better idea how to get rid of horse manure on the streets. There were more horses and carts, and you can imagine the end result of that. Because and this was before Albert Einstein, but as Einstein observed, you cannot solve a problem from the level of the problem. You have to come at it from the level of the solution. So we're trying to get people off smoking. Yes, we can tell them to go cold turkey. We can get them to use patches. There are prescription medications. There are all of these ideas that have been around for a long time. If they all worked perfectly, there would be no smokers. But there are smokers. And what that tells us is that more of the same is not the answer. And ultimately, the horse manure crisis was solved about a decade later, not because somebody invented a better way of getting rid of horse manure off the street. It's because Henry Ford invented the motor car. And the motor car was not invented as a way to get rid of horse manure, but it ultimately did it because it came from the level of the solution, not the level of the problem. And e-cigarettes are about the level of the solution, not the level of the problem. So it's basically getting people off cigarettes by providing them with a better alternative. The car became a better alternative to the horse and carriage. In one day, we'll have better alternatives to the car as well. But at that point, that was the solution. All of these other quit smoking methods are not providing people, and they do work for people. So I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with them, obviously, but they don't really provide people who are not able to quit with a solution. And we see that Australia is falling behind. In the 1980s, Australia led the world in reducing rates of smoking. We did very, very well. The problem is a lot of the people who are still in tobacco control in Australia today have not left the 1980s. And they still think that Australia is the greatest, and it isn't. And you can see on this graph, and these trends have continued, that the UK and the US have gone past Australia. And that, not surprisingly, is because Australia does not support vaping. Australia has had, since 2012, plain packaging, and it has the highest per stick, and I'll talk about price in a moment, stick prices for cigarettes. And despite that, levels of smoking have all but plateaued. Now, interestingly, there's been, arguments over e-cigarettes in this country for a number of years. I suppose, first got involved tangentially 4 or 5 years ago when I wrote a piece to one of the local media outlets about a fine for a local vendor. It was fined $45,000 for selling e-nicotine. I mean, seriously, they're going to fine him $45,000 for selling cigarettes. So in 2017, there was virtually no mention of vaping in Australia in the media. Between 2018 and 2021, increasing mentions and debate. We've had a couple of parliamentary inquiries as well. So you can see decline in annual smoking rates 2013 to 2015 and 16, sorry, and down the bottom of the list is Australia. Stone cold motherless last. Australia doing much better, Canada, England, and this here in New Zealand is before they've supported vaping. So if we look at the price of cigarettes, Winfield 25s, 1986, $2.66, 2019, $37. Go across again, I won't read them all out, but you can see massive increase in prices in cigarettes in Australia. This is from the New South Wales Traders Association. And every year taxation goes up. Tobacco excise in Australia is about the fourth biggest line item in the federal budget. It's worth about 15 to $17 billion. It's a lot of money. And if you look at it in graph form, you can see through the 1940s, really right up to about the 90s, not a massive increase. This is two different forms of cigarette. Winfield, was one of the most popular brands in Australia. I don't know if it still is or not. And you can really see this sharp increase in price, and it continues to go up each year. And there is some fallout. As the price goes up each year, there are some people who stop, but a lot of people cannot and do not, and they either turn to the black market, and the amount of black market tobacco coming into Australia has skyrocketed, or they buy less food for their kids, which is just, again, an appalling outcome. And meanwhile, the public health people congratulate themselves on how fantastic it is that they're extracting more money out of poor people. And by and large, it is people from lower socioeconomic groups that tend to be have the highest rates of smoking. And as I said before, 80%, up to 80% people with mental health problems, 40% in Indigenous populations, very high in homeless populations as well. But, that doesn't seem to bother the public health brigade. So if we look at a world comparison, Australia, very high, New Zealand, number 2, right the way down. And yet, if you look at the UK, with prices almost half of Australia, and the US, about a third of Australia, much cheaper cigarette prices and faster rates of decline of smoking. Now this, I'm going to really now contrast the New Zealand and Australian approach. And this is a screenshot from the New Zealand Ministry of Health. Find out the best ways to give up smokes for good. The facts of vaping versus smoking. And essentially what they're doing in New Zealand is encouraging people to switch to vaping. They're making it easier for people to do it. They're giving them factual information. Nobody in New Zealand is telling people who don't smoke to take up vaping. Of course they're not. The best, the best substance to go into your lungs is fresh air. We all know that. We can all agree about that. But the New Zealand government is providing facts and support. And they're also aware that in the Maori population, there are high rates of cigarette smoking. Higher than in the general population. So they've made that a particular focus, and they've made it quite easy for people to access nicotine liquid. They don't need a prescription. My partner's from New Zealand. We go over there. We haven't been able to, obviously last year and this year, to visit my father-in-law who is ailing a little bit. And you can go to a petrol station or a gasoline station, as you probably call it in America, and buy cigarettes if that's your one. It's behind the counter. It's not advertised. It's not promoted. Or you can buy nicotine liquid and vapes. So it is no more difficult to buy the less harmful alternative, which is where New Zealand is at. And they're at vape stores. Nobody needs a prescription. And they're providing the citizens of New Zealand with facts, such as vaping is at least 95% less harmful than smoking. They've sort of picked up the mantra of the UK government. Again, from the New Zealand Ministry of Health, smoking is bad for your health as toxins produced by burning tobacco cause smoking-related illnesses. The majority of health benefits are seen when you stop smoking completely. Vaping is not harmless, but is much less harmful than smoking. The healthiest option is not to vape or smoke. Don't vape if you don't smoke. Only vape to quit smoking. How simple is that? How simple is that? Relative harm, smoking, vaping. And it really, It's about as straightforward as can get, and it's factually based. There's no ideology. There's none of this big tobacco conspiracy garbage that gets peddled in Australia. There's not the outrage about youth vaping. And no, we do not want teenagers to vape. We don't want them to use drugs. We don't want them to drink alcohol. There's a lot of things we don't want teenagers to do. Teenagers may tend to do it anyway, and making it harder for adult smokers to stop smoking doesn't actually stop teenagers from experimenting. So very simple, factual, non-emotive information. This is from, again, the New Zealand Health. There is general agreement that vaping use exposes the user to fewer toxicants than smoking tobacco cigarettes. And this is from the Cochrane Review. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. It's the biggest independent assessor of medical studies and data. So it's not, because anybody in Australia who supports vaping is a stooge of big tobacco. We're all on the payroll. We're all evil, nasty people who are paid by big tobacco. Apparently the Cochrane Review must be in that camp as well. And so again, the New Zealand Health Ministry using very balanced factual information that comes from somewhere like the Cochrane collaboration. And this is from the New Zealand Herald, which is the main newspaper in Auckland, the largest city. Cigarette sales down as vaping up. I mean, that is what anybody in public health you would think, and in Australia you'd be wrong, you would think was what they want. Cigarette sales down. People buying less cigarettes. Effectively, that means people are smoking less. Okay, so the 2025 smoke-free target won't be met. Look, I think that's probably fair enough. I think the likelihood of any country in the world having nobody smoking by 2025 is not going to happen. It's ridiculous. It's nice to have a target, but it's not realistic. But lower is better. So we don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If we can get it down lower, fantastic. But cigarette sales down as vaping up. I mean, that really sums up what should be the approach of any country in the world. Cigarette sales are plunging faster than at any time before as smokers turn to alternatives like vaping. 410 million fewer smokes sold annually than just 2 years ago. Dr. Murray Lawgerson, trustee of End Smoking New Zealand, found a remarkable drop in sales. And End Smoking New Zealand, probably their equivalent would be, is there a question there? Oh, okay, I'll get to that later. Oops, hang on, let me just go back. Sorry, my bad. Is sort of the equivalent of ACOSH over here, and ACOSH over here are just ideological. That's about as much as I can say about them. Really just entirely obsessed with a big tobacco conspiracy. Whereas in New Zealand, their equivalent really is just looking at data and facts, and less cigarettes sold, massive drop. The latter had advanced from nicotine patches and gums, so these are the alternatives we're talking about, to e-cigarettes and heat-not-burn devices. So it's an advance. So we've had nicotine patches and gums, and there's a role for them, and they help some people, but it doesn't help everybody. Heat-not-burn devices to heat tobacco and electronic cigarettes are an advance on nicotine patches and gums. So these are, they're using nicotine. All these products have nicotine in them, but these delivery systems are even more effective, and we know that, more effective than their predecessors. So the chair of End Smoking New Zealand has recognised that although electronic cigarettes and heat-not-burn products are not perfect, the best thing is not to use any of these products if we're to convert our smoking epidemic into a situation of people using reduced harm products. That would actually be a much better situation. Now, that is just logic based on science, based on research, based on data, based on the real world. This is really saying we've got a problem. People are continuing to smoke. We know people die as a consequence of this. We know that people who are not able to quit, can we do more to help them? And that's not saying that there'll never be a smoker. Some people, despite everything, may continue to smoke, but we can reduce the harm. And that's the New Zealand approach, and it really is a credit to them. And look, that's just a picture I took when we were over there. again, showing you can buy the cigarettes there behind in the cupboard there on the left, and there are the vape products on the on the right. So you can get one or the other. Really simple. Nobody has to go to their doctor to get a prescription. Again, positive messaging. Tired of smoking? It's time you try vaping. How simple is that? People may not have thought about it. It gives them the opportunity to think about it and to try. And obviously, that's a store that's selling selling vape products. And again, on display in a retail store. It's not for under 18s. A bit like you can't go into a liquor store and buy alcohol under the age of 18. Then Australia, 2010 to 2013, 317,000 less smokers. 2013 to 2016, 21,000 more smokers. Government excise, as I mentioned before, 11.2 billion in 2017, rising to nearly 16 billion in 2021. And next year could be sort of closer to $17 billion in the tax year that's just started. But here we are, more smokers. And the sort of nonsense that we've come up against in this country, in 2014, I think it was, the opera company in WA, that's where I live in West Australia, was going to put on a performance of Carmen, the opera, written in the 1700s. Shock horror, it's set in a tobacco factory. It's an opera, Carmen. The anti-smoking lobby, Healthway, government funded, of course, arced up. They were a sponsor of the symphony orchestra, and essentially said that they would withdraw their funding and told the symphony opera they were not allowed to put on a performance of Carmen the opera because it would glamorize smoking. This is the sort of crap that passes for public health in this country. You can just imagine these people who go to the opera, and in all honesty, there's probably a certain, and look, my late mother was a big opera fan. It didn't really rub off on me to a great degree, I will confess. But the sort of people who are likely to go to the opera probably are not likely to be the sorts of people where smoking rates are very high. And you just can't somehow imagine the situation. Somebody goes to the opera, sees Carmen, comes out and decides, I know what I'm going to do. I've never done this before. I'm going to take up smoking. The contempt for the intelligence of people by the public health lobby in this country really is something to behold. Long story short, to its credit, the government got involved, and the people who proposed this, most of them are no longer involved in that charity, but they're still on the government payroll somewhere, I am sure. But this shows you the mentality of people who think staging an opera is a problem. And look, this is an article by Ronald Dworkin, was published a couple of years ago. Really talks about the lack of humility and lack of rigor in public health. And it's a very interesting article. You can read it, and basically again says that the arrogance and attitude of the know-it-alls ends up causing people to smoke. And really in this country, we have this concept that the sky is falling. You've heard of that. There's an epidemic of youth vaping because about 1% of teenagers vape, and they shouldn't. I don't want them to vape. I don't want them to smoke. I don't want them to drink alcohol. I certainly don't want them to use crystal methamphetamine. And some of them are going to. But we don't want smokers to die needlessly if we can help them. And it is possible to do both. So we've heard today, and I've been interviewed about this, but with this new regulation tomorrow forcing people to get a prescription, won't that prevent youth vaping? Well, no, it won't. If they want to vape, they will, and they'll find a way to do it. So here's helpful information from the Australian government website. We saw the snapshot from the New Zealand government website before. Simple, plain language, easy to understand, graphically showing the difference between smoking and vaping. And here we have the Australian website, very helpful. TGA announced a decision that the importation of nicotine, I won't read it all out, nicotine, e-cigarettes and liquid nicotine for vaping will require a valid prescription. This aligns with current domestic restrictions under state and territory law that surprise. So, we're from the government and we're here to help you. Not. If anybody can even understand that or even is able to find it, that would be a bit of a miracle. And then it goes on to explain about the scheduling on the poisons schedule. Consumers will need a valid prescription to access nicotine e-cigarettes and liquid. So provide an opportunity, fantastic, an opportunity for consumers to receive appropriate medical advice on options for smoking cessation, because nobody has ever heard of other quit smoking options. I mean, nobody's ever heard of patches or gums. Like, nobody's ever been to a supermarket in this country where you can buy these things. Now, yes, there are no approved nicotine e-cigarettes on the register of therapeutic goods. Who cares? I don't. It shouldn't be on the register of therapeutic goods. It should be a consumer option. So the opportunity for people to import overseas with a prescription still exists. If you want to buy it in Australia, and for the first time, fantastic, you can buy it in Australia. It's like they've done everybody a favour. Not. You not only need a prescription, you need a prescription from an authorised prescriber who has to get approval from the TGA. So it's about as complicated and as bureaucratic as you can make it. Again, supply in Australia. A simplified nicotine-specific online form is available. Well, look, I will confess I've seen worse government forms, but that's not saying very much. What will happen before October 21? The delicate blah, blah. So just the comparison between what the information provided to the public in Australia versus New Zealand. One is, we want you to stop smoking. We're going to tell you the facts. We're going to quote data and research and make it easy for you to quit smoking. And the other is, here's all this bureaucratic gobbledygook or garbage that probably most people won't even be able to find. And even if they did, they probably wouldn't understand. And we're just going to make it as difficult as possible for you to stop smoking. And here's the kicker. With all this regulatory change in Australia, which, as I say, kicks in, what's it now, just after 11, in about 57 minutes, sorry, from where I am. Nicotine products that are not affected, include nicotine replacement therapies currently available without prescription, patches, sprays, lozenges, chews. There are no changes to the availability of e-cigarettes that do not contain nicotine, fair enough. And cigarettes are not affected by any of this. So you can still go to the supermarket, the petrol station, the corner store, the deli, the vending machine, and buy cigarettes without a prescription. Because, hey, government in this country knows what it's doing. Which is probably how a lot of us feel. Maybe even worse, a bit more like beating your head against the proverbial brick wall. And ultimately, this is not based on data, science, real world evidence. It is based on ideology, and it reflects that the health minister, who I think is actually a genuinely decent man, as I'm given to understand, I've not met him, is, as is often the case in countries, a captive of his health department, and in turn, the health department is a captive of a coterie in Australia. And they're all joined at the hip together, and they all agree with each other, which means they're all correct. So whether it's the Heart Foundation, the Lung Foundation, the Cancer Council, they all agree with each other. They all send the money around in a circle, and they all suck on the government's teat. Now, in reality, it is about dollars. The government makes money. The quit lines all rely on funding. If everybody went over to e-cigarettes, there would be no need for a whole host of programs that are government funded and provide employment to people who might otherwise struggle to find a job. I mean, it's sad but true. And I've had it put to me a few times that, the biggest consideration in this is a monetary one. The Australian Medical Association, which supports, the prescription model, look, it's, money for doctors. Now, I am seeing patients for nicotine. I'm one of the few doctors who does prescribe. I'm flat out already just seeing my ordinary patients. I'm happy to help these people who need a prescription, but it would be much, 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 much better for them not to have to come and see me, but just to go and buy their e-cigarettes. So it really, the other argument that's been put is the government is trying to protect its tobacco excise revenue. I probably personally don't. I probably don't accept that. I think that is a little bit too Machiavellian. I think it's really just absolute ideology and this obsession in this country with this big tobacco conspiracy garbage. And ultimately, I like this quote from Machiavelli. I think I've got a minute or two left. And it ought to be remembered that there is nothing more difficult to take in hand more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. And even though it's been around for nearly 20 years now, nicotine is a new order of things. Because the innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under the old conditions. And that includes all the public health lobby in this country. And includes the AMA, it includes the various councils, it includes universities, it includes academics, it includes all the people who run all the quit programs. And lukewarm defenders in those who may do well under the new law. So the vapors will do well under new laws. They tend to they do their best, but they haven't got the resources or the capacity that well-funded government-funded people have. This coolness arises partly from fear of the opponents who have laws on their side, and partly from the incredulity of men who do not readily believe in new things until they have a long experience of them. Thus, it happens that whenever those who are hostile have the opportunity to attack, they do it like partisans. And believe me, they do in this country. They absolutely do. Whilst the others defend lukewarmly in such wise that the prince is endangered along with them. That's 500 years ago. 500 years ago, and nothing has changed. The partisans now are academics and public health lobbyists and people variably on payrolls of the government. And they're the new partisans. That said, I'm not feeling the best today, but I remain optimistic that eventually harm reduction works because it works and it's the right thing. It may take time. It does take time. It certainly will in this country. But eventually, history does teach us that tyranny falls over. We saw that with the Iron Curtain as well. And that what is right and correct for people, being them able to quit smoking and switch to a less harmful alternative, will eventually prevail. Unfortunately, it'll take longer than we'd like, and people will die before their time because of it. But eventually it will come. And hopefully, and my hope is that over the next couple of years, really people in this country will see rates of smoking in New Zealand fall quite precipitously, and rates of smoking in this country possibly not only not fall, but probably rise. And sense may come. Okay. All right. Now we did... So I'll stop sharing. Oh, somebody stopped me. And there was a question in the chat, which I was happy to
Yes, it
take.
was okay. But
Oh.
I can't find it now. Okay. Can you see it? The question
Where
for
was it?
Victor.
I had seen it somewhere, but I can't. Oh, here we go. How New Zealand policy deals with heat not burn products. Okay. I think in a similar way. Now, I'm not going to swear to this, but from what I've seen, that essentially you can go into vape shops. I think one of my slides show it, and you can buy Oakwose products the same as you can buy vaping. So yes, I could stand corrected, but I'm pretty sure that they are also available. Maybe not quite as readily as the liquid, but they're also covered under that act.
Okay.
There we go. Did find it.
We have another question. Thank you, Joe. We all enjoy your presentation that illustrates us how a policymaker can make reasonable intervention and affect public health issues. And I think your presentation focused on that. It is very important to listen and to learn from the public, not only from policy makers. If we have not another question, we can pass to the next session.